Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome. I thank Sheikh Tabraz for inviting me and for Ishad Institute for having me. And what I'm going to talk about is one of my main research topics is how Tafsir became a source of different discussions among the schools. So in what way does Tafsir represent a type of hermeneutics that's school aligned, that thereby becoming a form of school hermeneutics for a certain discipline hermeneutics. And I became interested in this topic when I became Muslim myself 20 years ago, based on study of reading the Qur'an as a translation. And I was always in that way Qur'an focused throughout my whole through all the different phases during my conversion period over the last years. And tafsir for me became a very useful genre, very useful discipline from where to understand the other ulum, to understand the other sciences. And through that, because I was so tafsir focused, I started to notice certain trends and certain ideas. And that is something I saw with people that are mainly focused, for example, on kalam only or on fiqh mainly, is that they see tafsir as sort of a side dish, something you do on the side. It is helpful, and so they also mainly don't have in what you can call an intellectual tradition approach towards tafsir. So for example, here behind me, this is my library here at the Islamic University. So you have here all the tafsir I have here. And and these are in historical order. That's something that's something when you develop in something you develop over time. When you focus on tafsir, you get this idea of trajectory. You get this idea of how certain people that are involved in tafsir, the early scholars, the early mufassirun, how they build on one another. And then you can start to see, you notice trends. And within the literature on tafsir and the development of tafsir, both Western, or let's say in English, but also in Arabic and also other languages, they mainly focus on typologies of tafsirs, as in what people do, as for example, they are, tafsir bil riwaya, tafsir bil diraya. So it's about, tafsir through narrative, tafsir through exegesis through traditions, or tafsir through mainly rational opinions and rational discernment. And that's true, you see that in tafsir. But there's a lot more going on. And this is one of the main things that is still being researched, what I notice, both within Islamic discourses, in Muslim discourse, and in, let's say, Western discourse, which also involves Muslims. So in a sense, the English Islamic studies, tafsir studies, and the non-English tafsir studies. It is still developing science and developing field, whereby we start to focus not simply on doing tafsir, but on studying tafsir as a science, as a genre, as a form of as an intellectual tradition. And in that, you're going to see trends. And that is something I focus on, especially how my own, I'm Hanafi Maturidi, and how did the Hanafi Maturidi express their voice within the tafsir tradition? Is there a distinct Hanafi voice within tafsir? And those are the things I started to focus on. Can you discern them? Can you point something out as, oh, that is truly, only a Hanafi would do that. Only a Maturidi would do that. Only a Shafi would do that. Only an Ashari would do that. So you get this, in a sense, these very forms of identity exegesis within the tradition. And an important, so, and also, why would we care? That's also another thing. Why is this a concern? is it really something that would matter? And this is something why I was also invited to give this talk, is in what way can we say there is a distinct Hanafi tradition of tafsir? And why does that matter? What does that give us? And it's almost a bit the same with the Maturidi tradition. The Maturidi tradition as a theological tradition, as a Kalam tradition, is very Hanafi focused, and it has a very Hanafi mindset. When you look at tafsir, it is mainly seen as a form of a meta science. And so the idea of tafsir, for example, a lot of text into the classical tafsir scholars, in their muqaddama, in their introductions to their tafsir, and even like very known texts like Baidawi's Anwar al-Tanzil, he would emphasize that tafsir is a rais al-ulum, it is the head of the sciences. And of course, a lot of sciences claim that for their fields. You see this with usul scholars, with the furu, the fiqh scholars in general. You see this with the scholars of grammar, saying, in a sense, everything you can know by grammar. You see this with kalam, the kalam discussions, like Taftazani, for example, says in his Shara on Nasafi, is that all the whole idea of Sharia, the Tashri, the idea of ahkam, to understand them, it's all grounded within the field of Aqidah and Kalam. So that's the first science, or the primary science. What is unique about tafsir is one of the, as far as I have seen it develop in my research, how I've seen over the ages how tafsir starts to accumulate in relation to the different sciences, is that it is one of the only sciences where every other science ends up with. So in Kalam, not a bit of usul al-fiqh, sometimes a little bit of tafsir, a little bit of shar al-hadith, a little bit of maybe a bit of furu ends up in Kalam. But in ilm al-kalam, technically, it has a very specific focus, and it doesn't need any sidekicks from the other ulum to be involved. When it comes to usul al-fiqh, of course, is more, apart from the linguistic hermeneutics, it also involves a form of moral hermeneutics. The moral hermeneutics itself is grounded again in kalam. So in that kind of way, usul al-fiqh is attached, or let's say an extension in some aspects of ilm al-kalam. You see this with a lot of other sciences. They're sort of attached to one or two other sciences. Tafsir is one of the only sciences where all those sciences end up in. And this is especially what we will see with the Ottoman Tasir tradition, is that it starts in the Ottoman Tasir tradition, of course, a very mature tradition, because it was in the late medieval and early modern period. And I'm going to discuss this a bit later. And what they started to do is they started to see tafsir as something that acknowledges all the ulum that are out there. So even secular ulum, things that are aqliya, things that are not that are riwaya, they're not directly tradition-based, tanzil-based. So even the non-revealed sciences, like politics, siyasa, etc., with the Ottomans, it all ends up in their commentary on the Quran, because the Quran is seen as the fountain of all the ulum. And so what you end up with is something that Walid Saleh, one of the major Western-based in English, writing in English on tafsir studies, Walid Saleh from McGill of Toronto, if I'm correctly, either two, in his chapter in the Handbook of Quranic Studies, he which represents his latest conceptualization of where tafsir studies is going. And Walid Saleh is seen by the majority of scholars in English-speaking, or let's say English-focused tafsir studies scholars, which includes Muslims and non-Muslims. Walid Saleh is seen as the grandfather of tafsir studies, how it's going now, in the direction where it's going. And so he emphasizes, for example, that tafsir grounds developing thoughts and sciences in the revealed worldview. So one of the functions of tafsir is to provide a foundation, a ground for the sciences to have a place within the worldview that comes out of revelation. One of the other terms that he, in a sense, is using is this idea of what you can say is the Quranification of the sciences. Or another term he's using, the idea of tafsir as a meta language of Islam. And one of the things that he noticed, and I agree with him on this, is that you can see that tafsir becomes a vehicle to resolve dilemmas of the intellectual tradition. One of my main articles where I discuss the idea of divine respite, the idea of imhal, the idea of where Allah withholds intervention in the world and withholds it until the day of judgment. So this idea of divine respite, the idea of imhal, the idea of that Allah suspends his judgment until the day of judgment, which is one of the explanations given by scholars for why people are allowed to do kufr on earth, why people are allowed to do shirk on earth. And this discussion about divine respite is technically not really present in any form of kalamic discourses. But it is a kalamic discussion. It is a form of ilm al-kalam discourse. But it only is, as far as I've seen, it is almost only present within tafsir. So tafsir also represents this extension of the other sciences for some of the sciences, especially kalam. So you don't really see any new discussions on fiqh al-furu' going on in tafsir. So tafsir, when it comes to certain sciences, like the ahkam al-Qur'an works. So that is a form of tafsir works that focus on grounding fiqh opinions within the Qur'an and showing the connection between the Qur'an and the Quranic language and the way fiqh opinions are grounded. There are almost no surprises in those works. So in the works of Jassas and others, you don't see a lot of surprises going on in there. Also with some other subjects like language and rhetoric, not a lot of surprises are directly in the Quran that provide something new for that ilm, for that science. But when it comes to, especially for ilm al-kalam, there are a lot of new material found in tafsir about kalamic opinions, theological opinions, that you don't find in kalam works. That mainly has to do, from my perspective, with the fact that kalam works. So if you take a book like Kitab al-Tawhid of Maturidi, the way he talks in there is a form of structured opinion, a structured argument that starts with, okay, what are the asbab of ilm? What are the sources of knowledge? And for example, how things are grounded in reason, how theology should not be based on taqlid, on blind following. And then he goes on, so, okay, you have the hadaf al-alam, you have the contingency of the world, which proves the existence of a creator. When you have the creator, then it means this. So you have this stacking of argumentations with implications, premise, implication, premise, implication. So it's a sort of logical structure that builds on itself. The Quran, on the other hand, has its own structure. So you cannot write the tafsir on your own terms. Most tafasir are written according to the order of the text itself. So it is a syncretic science. It follows the order of the structure of the text. It doesn't follow any topical order, or it doesn't follow any temporal order. So there are some tafsir works that of course are modern works, that try to provide the order of the Quran according to the asbab nuzul, the idea of the order of revelation, which is a very speculative way of ordering the text, because there's for at least half of the surah, the half of the chapters of the Quran, and more than half of the ayat, of the verses of the Quran, there's no consensus of in what way they are Meccan or Medinan, and also in what order there are. So there's no consensus on this. There are overlap opinions, but there's no full consensus. So a diachronical order of the Quran, a temporal order of the Quran, is a very speculative science that some have tried to do within modern tafsir studies. But in the history of, let's say, pre-modern tafsir studies, one of the only texts that did that was the Asbab Nuzul works, and even then still they would hold on to the order of the surahs. So they would still, so although they bring in temporal discussions, the idea why and when something is revealed, it still holds on to this main structure of the text, how the mushaf is ordered. So the order of argumentation, so when you discuss something, is determined by the Quran. It is not determined by your logical argumentation, your structure of logics. So the tafsir also provides room and space for discussions, for side discussions that would not fit within normal kalamic works. And in that way, tafsir is very unique. It can also discuss usul, it can discuss furu, it can discuss natural philosophy in a way that it's out of order. It doesn't follow the system of the ilm. It doesn't follow the system of the genre. It follows the system of the Quran itself. So therefore, that's something also why tafsir becomes this sort of testing case, testing ground in relation to the maturity of the ilm itself. If the science, if the discipline has a certain maturity, it can fit in tafsir in a way that it makes sense. If the science itself is very immature, still developing, it feels a bit alien in tafsir discourses. This is something, for example, you can see with certain philosophical discussions that Razi, for example, has in his tafsir, although Razi is a master, and he's a master mufassir. There are certain discussions that he brought into tafsir that technically nobody did before, and almost nobody tried after. So there are certain things that, in a sense, Razi got away with it, but not everybody could do that in relation to falsafa, in relation to hikmah, philosophy. Because it demands from you to be so mature in that science that you can get away with that. Same thing how Zamakhshari completely in his tafsir completely changed the way tafsir was viewed. So the way he introduced rhetorics, balagha, the idea of ijazul Quran, the way how he created this language focus in tafsir that is really unique. And there's in tafsir studies, there's a clear before and after Zamakhshari, because after Zamakhshari, the way he uses language to present the bayan of the Quran is something that changed the whole way of how people would view language in the Quran and how they would connect language in the Quran. So there are clear markers within the tafsir tradition where a science becomes mature, and then it becomes present in the Quran, and it changes the whole tafsir tradition itself, wherein there's a clear before and after. So this is again how tafsir is a sort of measurement of the development of the ulum itself, the Islamic sciences itself. And both the revelatory sciences, so the ulum naqliya and the ulum aqliya. And what you see, of course, is that in the first phase of tafsir, they mainly focus on textual discussions. But after the millennia, especially after Ibn Sina, we have what we call the Avicennian turn. Before Ibn Sina, there's almost no philosophy, or especially philosophy of nature, cosmology, is not discussed in tafsir. After Ibn Sina, after Avicenna introduces new ways of doing philosophy from a Muslim perspective, this invades all the ulum, all the sciences of Islam. When it comes to mantiq, logic, when it comes to the idea of ilm al-daqiq, the idea of the science of nature, this cosmology, astronomy, everything. So there's this clear turn in the ulum, and you see also this in tafsir. One of the things that I'm researching now is that before Ibn Sina, like I said, there's almost no natural philosophy present within tafsir discourse. After Ibn Sina, it completely takes off. It becomes normalized. And so you can clearly see this trajectory of the tafsir sciences, tafsir as a science, as a sort of testing ground of how mature a type of science or thinking is. And you can also see these paradigm shifts within the paradigm shifts going on in certain sciences also create paradigm shifts in tafsir itself. So in that way, tafsir is a very important measurement of the trends within the Islamic intellectual tradition. So I will move on to the next sheet. So here, this is a short list of how you can think of certain epochs within the tafsir tradition. And these also partially align with the development of other sciences, fiqh, kalam, you name it, and you could see in a sense almost these type of sort of 5 phases. There's a lot of disagreement about how you draw lines in the sand of what is an epoch or not. But I find these by Haim Graeber as one of the best ones that these 5 phases do really align with certain paradigm shifts within Islamic thought. So you have the pre-classical period, so that's the first 3 centuries, which is also called the formative period, which is the formative period of the sciences itself, of the madahib, of the schools. So first you get a science, and out of the science you get schools. So certain trends, certain ways of doing the science also creates types of typologies, and those typologies create schools. So, and a lot of times that typology is represented by a person like Abu Hanifa, like Malik. So the hermeneutics is very much grounded in the type of person. So him being mujtahid, for example, Abu Hanifa being mujtahid mutlaq, the idea of this sort of absolute having this supreme mujtahid perspective in the formative phase, meant in a sense that he is introducing a type of looking at the sources, looking at the tradition, and the way to interpret it and apply it. That system of interpretation, that system of approach, that system of engagement, that type of hermeneutics becomes a school. What you see in the classical period is that instead of, so that's the second phase, the classical phase between the 10th and the 12th century. And these, of course, are Gregorian. So that is of course, from the 4th to the 6th Hijri century. In the classical phase, you get that you don't get these, you don't get a lot of people that are these enigmas where they can found a science or determine the direction of a science. Instead, that science is represented now by a sort of collective of schools, typologies of schools. And in the classical phase, people develop themselves within a typology, within a certain type of school. So you have Abu Hanifa in the formative phase. In the classical phase, you are Hanafi. You now follow a certain type of typology of thinking, interpreting, approach. So you have the Hanafi approach towards the tradition, towards the revelation, but also towards how you view the community, how you view non-Muslims, etc. So there's, in the classical phase, there's a sort of, it becomes an identity, whereby hermeneutics in approaches, methodology is the same as having an identity. In the mature phase, it means you get this expansion of the school. You get defining texts that are chosen as being the representation of the formative and classical phase. And those are built upon. So this is also the rise of the commentary tradition. So in the commentary tradition, the super commentary tradition, they are building on the formative and classical phase texts that are school defining texts. So Quduri, and then you have the texts that expand on Quduri, you know. And in the early modern period, so from the 15th and 17th century on, there's a sort of secondary mature phase where they again have a sort of reselection of texts. And this is mainly the Ottoman period. So the Ottoman phase is especially in this early modern period from the 15th century on, where the Ottomans start to redefine the idea of what it means to be Hanafi, what it means to be Maturidi, what it means to be Sunni, what it means to be a sultanate, what it means to be a khalifa. So you get this full rethinking what's going on. By the way, I now see that the PowerPoint, that the sheet doesn't 100% align in a way that it should have been. So let me see now that it is wrong in that sense. Give me a second. So. Give me a second. I want to make sure that it represents it correctly. There you go. That's a bit better. Sorry. Yeah. Let me reshare it. There you go. That's a better representation. So. Okay, so what it means to be Hanafi, for example, is the Hanafi school itself. The Hanafi school itself is present in all these phases. The Maturidi school, which is, let's say, that is the Hanafi branch in Kalam, is also present in all these phases. Yeah. So we can therefore ask two types of questions. Either we see something distinctly Hanafi, or Tafsir is in a sense the same in all these phases. Now, one of the things that, of course, in my research has shown is it's not. There's a clear Hanafi approach to things. So when is a Mufassir a Hanafi? So when can you say a Mufassir is a Hanafi, as in it is, he can be this, you can see this distinct identity? Not always. So if you take on a text, for example, you take a Nasafi, and of course, you can just, now we have, alhamdulillah, we also have, oh, he's behind me. We also now have Abu Hafs Nasafi, his text, you know, the writer of the Aqaid al-Nasafiyah. We have Abu Barakat al-Nasafi with his Madarik. So in what way, if you look at those Hanafi texts, same thing with Alusi in his Ruh al-Ma'ani, there are certain things that doesn't make him a Hanafi. He just is somebody who studies the Quran, for example, based on language and rhetoric. And there are other, especially when it comes to the ulum al-ala, also, for example, you could add mantik to it, is that that there are general sciences that doesn't necessarily represent any school. These are just simply technical sciences that are empty of somebody's ticking very hardy on a keyboard. So there are certain general sciences that in a sense are neutral when it comes to school defining hermeneutics. Although of course some of these are started at the end also represent, for example, when it comes to language, when it comes to grammar, you have the Basriyun, the Kufiyun, and what we do see is that certain scholars of, for example, the Hanafi or the Shafi'i prefer the Basriyun or the Kufiyun, but at the same time, those grammar schools are neutral. And please close the door. And same thing with rhetoric. There are certain ways of where you can say that certain scholars latch into certain types of rhetorics more than with others. Same thing, mantik. But technically, these are neutral sciences. Therefore, also you could, even as a Sunni, we have used Shi'i texts sometimes, in the tradition on certain topics, because there's no, the author is Shi'i, but the science itself is not school defined, because these are technical instrumental sciences, the ulum al-ala, that are simply neutral in that sense. But there are also certain topics that he's not a Hanafi, he's Ahl Sunnah, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah. Like, for example, if you look at the way the Kaba'ir, the major sins are discussed, then it is the Ahl Sunnah versus the Mu'tazila, or versus the Khawarij, but mainly the Mu'tazila, where you get this idea of what you see, the Qawl Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, or the Ta'wil Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah. And these revolve, for example, about things that the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah agree upon that really defines them from the other schools. So these are this is the meta identity, the Sunni identity that overarches being Hanafi or Maturidi. So like the major sins, also the Ruyat Allah, the seeing Allah in the hereafter, but also, for example, philosophy of nature, cosmology, whereby the philosophers are the opponents. So for example, the idea of the Qidam, the eternity of the world. Those are things then where the Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah present themselves in relation to philosophers as theistic. We are theists. We believe in the contingency of the world and the non-eternity of the world, versus the philosophers who are mainly deistic. They believe in a non-engaged, non-involved God. So the philosophers have issues with Allah as a fa'il, as an agent, while the Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah emphasize their adherence towards theism, the idea of God, Allah, as an agent, as a willing God, as an active God, who has no obligations upon him. He is the one who makes the obligations. Then you have the Hanafi, where you can see that Hanafi distinctly becomes the Hanafi. And this is where, of course, what makes a Hanafi? Now, technically, Hanafi is a school of fiqh. So what is a Hanafi? A Hanafi identity is aligned with this approach towards ahkam, the fiqh al-furu'. It is the approach in usul al-fiqh. So if you look at tafsir with certain verses, especially the ayat al-ahkam, and there's a very nice work, for example, on this, about the manhaj of the Hanafiya fi tafsir ayat al-ahkam, and several other works on this. And of course, the Hanafi especially have a very deep and engaged tradition in the Ahkam al-Qur'an tradition. So the fiqh focused form of tafsir. And there they show this school defining hermeneutics about the school defining hermeneutics where the Hanafi sticks out in relation to the Shafi'i or the Malikiya or the Hanbali or other schools. But of course, mainly the Shafi'i, like in the, and this is what we see, the other of the Hanafi is the Shafi'i. So the other, the one you're responding to in fiqh for the Hanafi is the Shafi'i. In the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah role, the other is mainly the Mu'tazila. But there's also a very distinct discussion within the Qur'an about theology, a lot of topics of kalam, and there the Hanafi becomes Maturidi. Sometimes Ash'ari, of course, there were several Hanafiya that were more aligned towards the Ash'ari perspectives. And also certain topics were engaged in by the Ash'ari, and the Maturidi left that alone because it was not their central concern. And also after a while, the Ash'ari already done the groundworks, like with philosophy of nature. So a lot of philosophy of nature done by the Ash'ari it's just simply taken over by the Maturidi. You can see this in the Maqasid of Taftazani, but also with other major works of the Maturidi. They simply incorporate the Ash'ari engagement with philosophy of nature, because that is something that is what distinguishes the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah from the philosophers. It doesn't necessarily distinguish the Ash'ari from the Maturidi or the other way around. But there are other verses in the Quran where you distinctly become Maturidi in relation to maybe the Mu'tazila. But what you see with the Ottoman tradition, because the Ottoman tradition started to emphasize their Hanafi Maturidi identity, is they started to distinguish themselves from the Ash'ari. So suddenly with the Maturidi perspective in Ottoman Hanafi tafsir, the Ash'ari becomes the other of the Maturidi. The Mu'tazila also sometimes, like for example, with the Atfal al-Mushrikeen, the state of, what happens to children of the Mushrikeen, the children of unbelievers who die, what is the status of them on the Day of Judgment? And then the Maturidi have certain perspectives that align with some issues with the Ash'ari, but clearly is something that defines them as other in relation to the Mu'tazila. But there are also discussions between the Maturidi and the Ash'ari where which is brought into tafsir by Hanafi Maturidi scholars. And if you look at the Quran, so you have 6,000 plus Quran verses. Of those 6,000 plus Quran verses, about 500 are involved in what you can say about ayat al-ahkam, are ayat that revolve around ahkam or around certain usul discussions. Like, for example, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 29, khalaqa lakum. So, khalaqa lakum, we created everything for you. This is used in many tafsir. This Quran verse and this discussion about lakum, for you, the lam in this, is this a form of ta'lil? Is this a form of rationalizing the fa'ala Allah? And then, of course, you get this large discussion about this idea of mubah fi asl, the idea that if everything is created for us, khalaqa lakum, it means that in its asl, in its essence, everything is mubah. Everything is, of course, has a neutral, permissive status, whereby it becoming haram or let's say makruh is a secondary status that only revelation tanzil can technically ground, or the rational argument about harm, that something harms you, and therefore in that context it becomes forbidden for you. So these are usul discussions, usul al-fiqh discussions that are also then linked to certain Quran verses. But these are the minority of verses. So the minority of the Quran is not really furu focused. So being a Hanafi in tafsir is not the major identity. What I mainly see with Hanafi scholars, the majority of Hanafi mufassirun, is that they engage the Quran tafsir as a Maturidi, mainly. Why? Because the Quran involves a lot more discussions about theology, about kalam, than about fiqh. So the Maturidi, so in a sense, it is not about when is the Mufassir Hanafi, only with the minority of Quran verses about 500. But when it comes to kalam, you have more than 2,000 verses that you could directly link towards, that are very kalamic focused Quran verses. And technically even more, because almost every time a name, an isma of Allah is mentioned, kalam is partially involved. So when is the mufassir a general mufassir? When he's simply Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, when he's Hanafi, when he's Maturidi. The majority of Hanafi tafsir is Maturidi tafsir. And that has to do simply with the Quran being more theological than being juristic. So if you then look about how then does a Maturidi distinguish themselves from non-Maturidi, so I made this table in one of my publications where I discussed this, how the Maturidi define themselves in tafsir. And you could already see, if you look at different kalamic concerns, so how does one attain iman? How is iman and amal, faith and works, how are those connected to one another? How do you lose iman? So when do you fall into kufr? In what way is ethics involved? And therefore also taklif, moral responsibility. In what way, when is somebody punished on earth, like with the hudud? So when are you allowed to intervene on earth with you as a believer towards somebody else? So one is an interesting discussion in Maturidi's tafsir is that Maturidi emphasizes that during war with the kuffar that are killed during the war are not killed for their kufr. They are killed for their war status, being mukatilun. So he emphasizes that kufr on earth is not punished. So being killed in war for a kafir, for a non-believer, an unbeliever to be killed in a war, him being killed was not because of his kufr. Him being killed was because he was on the other side of the battle. And Maturidi emphasizes this several times in his tafsir, that you cannot be killed on earth for being a kafir. That is not enough. So this is this. So that is a distinct Maturidi argument of what's in a sense, how does certain faith status, like being a kafir is a status of your faith, how does that trigger a form of moral act in the world? Same thing about when it comes to horizontal actions between humans. What is about vertical actions where God, Allah, intervenes on earth? So the idea of worldly punishment. So when does Allah intervene in the world and change civilizational directions? And this we see with the Qisas al-Anbiya, the prophetic stories, how God destroys a people for certain reasons. What are the reasons for Allah for destroying these people? Is it because of their kufr? Maturidi emphasizes no. And we see this also with the Ash'ari. They say no, they're not destroyed because of their kufr. They're destroyed because of the destructive acts, the fasad fil earth that comes out of their kufr. If you compare this to the Mu'tazila and the Khawarij, for example, they would emphasize, no, people are punished on earth for being an infidel, being a kafir, or for being a grave sinner. So even, Muslims that are grave sinners that belong to the kaba'ir, that they themselves as fusuk can be punished on earth by God. Technically, the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah perspective is a bit more reluctant on that. So there are some that emphasize it, that mention this, that it's it is a punishment there or slash a test, etc. But at the same time, the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in tafsir at least are more reluctant to accept this idea that believers are punished on earth as a way of divine intervention, because the only large divine interventions that we understand them are related to the Qisas al-Anbiya. And in the Qisas al-Anbiya, in the prophetic stories, it is the people that reject the prophet that are killed and not the believers of the prophet. Those are saved. So they emphasize in that, like, to be a believer on earth is something that technically should save you from divine worldly punishment. Also in the punishment, of course, the discussion about eschatology and soteriology, the idea of, the idea of salvation. These, again, are large discussions. So certain Quran verses, for example, that are used by some to discuss about the eternity of the punishment are very important Quran verses. So does the idea of khalad, the idea of eternity, also imply the believing sinner Muslim? So the kaba'ir, so the grave sinner, the believing grave sinner, is he also eternally punished? Now the Mu'tazila say yes. The Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah use tafsir to show, like, no, those Quran verses that discuss about the eternity in hell are about responsible unbelievers. It is not everybody that enters into hell is eternally trapped into it. So then tafsir becomes a very important vehicle to have these very detailed, minute discussions about in what way does the Quran support my views, or in what way are my views grounded and come out of the Quran itself. Now, to give an example about how an Ottoman Hanafi Maturidi scholar both discusses kalam in relation to the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari. So here we have Isam al-Din al-Kunawi. So he's from the 18th century, and he was one of the major scholars in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, where he ran a madrasa. And his hashia, his hashia al-Kunawi on Baidawi's tafsir was seen as a tafsir you would read in your last years of your alamiya, of your madrasa studies. So when you've done all the ulum, you've studied all the ulum, and then in those last years, you would study with Isam al-Din al-Kunawi, and he would show you how all those ulum are grounded in the Quran. So it's a very extensive tafsir where all the rational and revelational ulum, sciences, are discussed as a form of tafsir in the Quran, are connected to the Quran. And one of the things he does as well, of course, he uses Maturidi discussions to respond to the Mu'tazila, but he also uses Baidawi as his Ash'ari other. And this is also one of the things that became very distinguished in the Ottoman era, in the Ottoman times, are works that discuss this, of course, this ikhtilaf between the Ash'ari and the Maturidi. And tafsir also became a representative of this development in kalam. So in Ottoman kalam, and of course it already developed a bit earlier with Subki and others that started to write these ikhtilaf works to understand in what way do the Maturidi and Ash'ari differ with one another. And the Ottomans started to write their own works from the Maturidi perspective of difference, of the Maturidi perspective on ikhtilaf. And because this became a mature science in the Ottoman Maturidi tradition, it ended up in tafsir. Because with the maturization of a science, you get it, in a sense, it slowly becomes incorporated into tafsir, because now it's a voice, a perspective that matters, and therefore it needs to be grounded in tafsir. So to give an example, this is a response to what we see here with Kunawi, is the famous verse in Surah Al-Isra, verse 15, that we don't punish a people until we send a messenger. And so Baidawi says, so first, of course, Qunawi is citing the matan, which is Baidawi. So he first cites Baidawi, then he responds to it. And Baidawi says, and in it is the proof that there's no obligation, qabla shari, of course, before the revelation of the divine law. Meaning there's no obligation on the mukallaf, on the responsible person, before the divine law is rationally, cognitively related to him. So bulugh, the idea that it reached him. Because if akal, reason, obligates by itself, so this is the whole discussion. If akal, what creates an obligation towards a hukm? Is it the shari, the tanzil, the revelation, or are there certain ideas based on akal, based on reason, that can obligate you towards certain acts, to do certain acts, in the absence of revelation? Baidawi, being an Ash'ari, rejects this idea. For the Ash'ari, technically, only revelation, tanzil, can obligate certain acts. Before that, there's this idea of suspension. There's no clear responsibility on persons before revelation. So that's what he says. So Baidawi says, if akal, if reason obligates, it is required that when he leaves the obligation unfulfilled, he's liable for divine punishment. So everybody that did not receive revelation and they acted out their lives and then they die, they end up with the day of judgment and they're going to be like, what is happening here? And then they are told they were responsible for certain acts in their lives. Then the Ash'ari say that doesn't make sense because that person could not know their obligation from certainty. Yeah. So Baidawi says, the Exalted clearly states that, and we do not punish until we send a messenger, which nullifies any required punishment. And then Qunawi starts to come in. Now the Ottoman Hanafi Maturidi response. So then the Maturidi, so Qunawi as a Maturidi says, and Baidawi intends here to refute, do rad, of the scholars of the Maturidi and to slander, tashni, the Mu'tazila, as they both state that akal, reason, rules by obligation over all matters. And from this statement, they establish that good and evil are known by reason. So here, Qunawi acknowledges that the Maturidi and the Mu'tazila, this is something they agreed on, the ittifaq. There's an agreement between the Maturidi and the Mu'tazila on that akal can provide obligations in amal, in acts. Where even in the absence of revelation, qabla shari, before revelation, God can hold you accountable for not performing the act or for performing, so for or not performing the act. But then he also, so first of all, Qunawi's response is, Baidawi is the Ash'ari, and we Maturidi and Mu'tazila, technically we Hanafi, are different from Baidawi in this. And then he does something else. But our scholars of the Maturidi follow the opinion that good and evil, so husna and shar, are known by reason as established by the most wise, al-hikam, which is God the Exalted. And this is here, Qunawi differentiates himself from the Mu'tazila. So first he responds to the Ash'ari, then he responds to the Mu'tazila, yeah, and then he also expands this. He starts to provide identification of, so what are we Maturidi? So then he gives an explanation of what do we Maturidi really say on this. So then he says, and that similar matters such as belief in the Prophet ﷺ are divinely imposed by the divine law. And when something is not imposed by the divine law, it is obligated by reason when it falls under rationally known ethics. Therefore, the messenger, the Rasul, in this ayah is universal, is is therefore meaning reason. And this is already mentioned also by Maturidi in his tafsir. They don't see the Rasul of this Quran verse. They understand this Rasul as being akal, being a messenger. And this is the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa, in that anyone to whom revelation has not reached, and he does not believe in the existence of God and his oneness, then that person will be in the hellfire forever. And this is a fact known by reason. So in this tafsir by an Ottoman scholar, you can see him respond to the Ash'ari and respond to the Mu'tazila, and then identify what is Hanafi being Hanafi Maturidi. How does this distinguish us? Yeah. So this is a very good example of how, in a sense, how the Hanafi Maturidi started to distinguish themselves. Another example is the very famous tafsir text by Abu Barakat al-Nasafi, so his Madarik, you know, and we know from intellectual history that that his tafsir was a sort of sunification of Zamakhshari's text. Same thing with Baidawi, but the difference with Baidawi is Baidawi integrated, sort of summarized both Al-Ghazi's tafsir and Zamakhshari's tafsir into a sort of madrasa text. What Nasafi did was simply, it's a bit like the Jefferson Bible. He simply cut out the things that he did not like of Zamakhshari, but he also sometimes realigned the text. And this is something I try to show here. So on the left, you have Zamakhshari. On the right, you have Nasafi. And what you can see is that, and this is their tafsir, their exegesis on Surah Al-Hud, verse 117. And your Lord does not destroy the communities bi-zulm, with injustice, as long as his people are muslihun, or right doers. So on the left, you see Zamakhshari. And on the right, you can see what Nasafi did with it. He shortened the text. So you can see what I've done on the left, what is emboldened in gray. So what is marked out in gray is what Nasafi took out of the text. Now, if we let us look at this. Yeah. So first of all, he took the above discussion out, and this is with the meaning, the ma'ana of truth and uprightness. Yeah, he cut that out. Is this a Maturidi deletion of the text? No, he probably simply felt that this was unnecessary in the text. Then Nasafi cut out, and its meaning is that it's impossible from divine wisdom. Technically, this is something the Maturidi agree on, that the idea that hikmah, that Allah is, that the hikmah of Allah, that Allah's, the fa'ala Allah, the acts of God, are grounded in the hikmah of Allah. But what is not, where the Maturidi becomes more careful, is to say istahal, the idea of something being impossible for Allah. So he felt that this was a far too strict statement by Zamakhshari, and he cut that out. Yeah. And then he did something else as well. You can see the great bar, and proclaims with it that he destroyed right doers due to their own wrongdoing. Again, he cut this out because he felt that this was an unnecessary statement. Yeah. So now on the left, you have Zamakhshari being a Mu'tazila, and on the right, we have Nasafi. So Nasafi, in that point, made a sort of Maturidi redaction of the Mu'tazila text. And he only cut out a little bit of the parts. Baidawi, on the other hand, did something, started to do, added a lot more other things. I discussed this extensively in my article, which I will share. It's available on my website, on my academia website. So if you Google me, Arnold Yasin Mol, academia, you can see divine respite in the Ottoman Tasir tradition. This is Ibn Kamal Pasha, the famous Kamal Pasha, the famous Shah al-Islam during Suleiman the Great, Suleiman Kanuni, Suleiman Fatih, Suleiman the Conqueror. And this is his tafsir on on the same Quran verse, Surah Al-Hud, Surah 11, verse 117. And here in gray, he is following he's following Zamakhshari. Yeah. So in gray is Zamakhshari. Yellow is Baidawi. Yeah. And yellow is Ghazi, and green is Baidawi. So what you get here is what Kamal Pashizada does, and this is how tafsir works. They are creating their own mix of text. Of course, Ibn Kamal Pasha, he's a very conscious Maturidi scholar. He's a very conscious Hanafi scholar. And this is about, especially this Quran verse is very kalamic. It's very theological. So what we see here is a mix of Mu'tazila and Ash'ari tafsir being mixed by Maturidi. And this is what you're going to get. So this is the Maturidi mix of the tafsir tradition. And this is my last sheet. This is, for example, what Isam al-Din Kunnawi, which we also just discussed, does with the same Quran verse. Again, Badawi is his matan, is his main text, his core text, and he uses that to expand a certain discussion. So he says, so he first cites Badawi statements because of idolatry, yeah, because of shirk. He explains Zoom here is shirk based on its exigency, and that its people are right doers. And Badawi's statement, what is between them, bainahum, is not between them and God regarding their kufr towards him. And Badawi's statement, and this, means the absence of destruction caused by the crime of idolatry. So here, Kulnawi agrees with the Ash'ari that Allah doesn't destroy people on earth simply because of shirk and kufr. But he makes it into a Maturidi mix of, so he uses an Ash'ari matan to and provide it with a Maturidi explanation of it. So his expansion is very typically Maturidi, but at the same time also, Baidawi is responding to the Mu'tazila. So sometimes Kulnawi is simply expanding it as an Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, as in anti-Mu'tazila, but sometimes he's also expanded it as a Maturidi, as in being the other of the Ash'ari. So this is a small example of, we could go endlessly, of course, into this, but these are some examples of how I do research on the Hanafi Maturidi in the Tafsir tradition, and how this provides very distinct voices, where you can very clearly distinguish the Hanafi Maturidi from the non-Hanafi Maturidi. And there are clearly trends and typologies into the Tafsir tradition that become more evolved and advanced over time into Ottoman times. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and into the modern age, so the 20th and 21st century, we have really lost these school-based approaches. So now we have almost become scared to have a very clear Ash'ari approach to things, a very clear Maturidi approach to things, a very clear Hanafi or Shafi approach to things. It is sort of something, sort of the unnamed. You don't name it. And you have to be vague and sort of, so now in a lot of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah approaches to tafsir, you stay within the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah field. So if you look at, so you don't have like a Hanafi Maturidi type of tafsir, you mainly have the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah approach to tafsir. Why? Because what has become the other? The Salafi, the modernist. So I do hope that we slowly start to develop again into these very specific type of school heuristics, because it is, those details matters. Those details provide very intelligent markers for the development of Islamic intellectual thought. Okay, thank you.